Captive Treasures, Chapter 7, Wolves of Hunger. Carrie awoke to quiet. It pressed at her from all sides like a live thing. She stared out at the strange light that filled the tepee. Something prickled against her eyelids, then her cheek. She sat up. It was cold. Everyone else lay bundled up in thick layers of fur. Nothing moved in the tepee. Carrie started to lie back down when a spattering of prickles teased their way across her nose. She glanced up and saw flakes of white drifting down from the opening at the top of the tepee. She threw back the furs and tiptoed to the flap. She pulled the flap back and looked out into a white world. Snow covered the bare trees in a blanket softer than the white fox skin Swift Arrow had brought home last week. It mounded over the rocks and drifted in banks next to the tree trunks. A gust of wind dashed a flurry of flakes against her face, and she backed away. She bumped against something solid. She looked up and saw Swift Arrow. He reached out and held the flap for her. "It's snowing," she said awkwardly. "Yes, the snow came early this year." He smiled down at her. He pointed toward the sloping fields where they had picked choke cherries warmed by the sun. "Good sliding place." Carrie looked startled. She glanced from him to the fields. "Sliding? Sledding?" "We peel bark from the trees, roll into sleds," he said. His eyes sparkled with memories. He chuckled. "I made a fine sled one year. I rubbed it with bear grease. My sled beat Lone Wolf's to the bottom every time." Carrie laughed uncertainly. "I guess he didn't like that." Swift Arrow agreed. "Lone Wolf does not like to be beaten. He wants to be chief some day. A chief must not be bested by anyone." "But I thought you would be chief," Carrie said, "not Lone Wolf." "He has brought back many horses, many coops. He is a good warrior." "He won't be a good leader," Carrie said stubbornly. "He cares for no one but himself." "The council will choose between us," Swift Arrow replied. "It will be their choice, not ours." Behind them the fur beds began to tremble. Little One tumbled out first. Sleepy-eyed, he stumbled to lean against Swift Arrow's leg. Both hands clasped around the young man's knee. "It's snowing," Carrie said. "It's snowing, Little One." The little boy didn't answer. Swift Arrow looked down and grinned. "He went back to sleep," he said. He lifted the child and put him back down beside his mother. Instantly awake, Small Bird and Laughing Water tumbled over each other to get to the door. Their shrieks of joy woke the others. The quiet burst like a pin-prickled bubble as they charged out into the drifts of snow. Swift Arrow stripped the bark from a tree. He made sleds for each of them, rubbing them well with bear grease. The girls slid, laughing and shouting, down the hill. When Little One cried, Swift Arrow made him a sled. He lifted the child onto it and sat behind him. Carrie stopped and stared as the young man and child slid down the hill and tumbled off into the snow. Little One clambered back on the sled. "Again," he said. "Ride me!" Small Bird demanded. "Your sled is faster." "This sled is not faster," Swift Arrow said. "You put all weight on front of sled. Sled does not want to go. Look." He shifted his weight. The sled moved. He leaned back. It stopped. "Now use weight to change directions." The girls were soon careening down the hill with the confidence of snowshoe rabbits. Swift Arrow picked up Little One. He brushed snow and ice out of the child's thick black hair and carried him back inside the tepee. It snowed again that night and the next. Snow piled in drifts around the outside of the tepee. Swift Arrow met the keeper's worried look. The snow had come too soon and too deep. Many animals would die from lack of food, and if the animals died, there would be nothing to eat. As the weeks passed, their fears were realized. The cook fire often burned under a pot of water and peeled bark. Carrie told the children the story of stone soup. It made them laugh to hear about a boy who managed to get some good soup when all he had was a stone, but it didn't fill their empty bellies. "We must return to the valley while we can," the keeper said. "Can you make the trip?" Sky Woman was worried. "If we stay here, I will surely die," he replied, "and so will all of you." "He is right," Swift Arrow said. "The snow will only deepen here. In the valley it will not stay on the ground so long. We will go." The next few days were spent in packing. Swift Arrow used 2 of the lodge poles to make a kind of long sled that he called a travois. He loaded it and strapped it to Sky Woman's horse. Then he made another and piled it high with furs. He strapped it to another horse. The keeper's mouth settled in a straight line. "I will ride my horse," he said. "I am no woman to be dragged behind like a sack." Swift Arrow stood beside the horse without speaking. No one moved. The keeper glared at him. Carrie smiled. Finally, the old man settled himself on the second travois, and he squirmed into the furs, grumbling all the time. They left the summer camp in a caravan of horses. Sky Woman went first, holding Little One in front of her. Carrie's horse followed in the narrow tracks made by the travois ahead of her. Laughing Water and Smallbird, muffled in brightly striped blankets, came right behind with the other travois. Carrie looked back at the travois, but all she could see of the keeper was a patch of gray hair and a feather. She had to laugh at the girls. They looked like tropical birds perched on the big horse that Swift Arrow had bridled for them. At first she could not see Swift Arrow. Then a cloud of snow sprayed up some distance to the right. Swift Arrow appeared, driving the remaining horses. He rode along beside them, keeping his lance ready. Carrie frowned at the lance. They had seen no sign of other Indians. Maybe he does that all the time, she thought. After all, he is a warrior. She put her worries out of her mind. The horses plodded and plunged their way through the snowdrifts. They rode until the trip was no longer fun. Then the girls huddled under their blankets, trying to keep warm. The wind howled through the treetops. When Carrie turned to look back, she couldn't see far. It was getting dark. The wind swept across the snowdrifts, blowing a fold of her blanket into her face. She pushed it aside. The howling sound came again, long and wavering. Swift Arrow stopped and turned toward it. He lifted his lance. Carrie shivered. It wasn't the wind. It was some animal, and it was hungry. Swift Arrow hurried his horse along the line of weary travelers. He stopped beside Sky Woman and pointed toward a distant ridge. She turned her horse in the direction he had pointed. Before full dark, they reached the ridge. Swift Arrow led them through the dead underbrush to a cave in the mountainside. They slid off the horses stiffly and turned them loose in the back of the cave. Carrie and the girls helped Sky Woman unpack the furs. Then she warmed Little One by the fire Swift Arrow had made. The child drifted off to sleep, and she tucked him into one end of the furs. The others curled up in the furs and chewed on strips of dry pemmican. The keeper watched Swift Arrow. The young warrior met his gaze, but neither of them spoke. After a while, Swift Arrow wrapped himself in a bearskin and settled down next to the cave opening. Carrie thought she was too scared to sleep, but morning came before she realized her eyes had closed. Swift Arrow was standing at the opening of the cave, looking out. Carrie got up to stand beside him. She could see nothing moving on the expanse of white in front of her. Swift Arrow moved back and kicked the fire to stir the embers. "I'll get the firewood," Carrie said quietly. He nodded and picked up his weapons. Carrie followed him out of the cave, walking in his footprints. When they broke dead branches off the bushes, the cracks sounded like rifle fire in the snow silence. Carrie was glad when they had enough. They found the tracks on the way back. Swift Arrow inspected the paw prints carefully. Carrie held her breath as tightly as she held the firewood. Finally it came out in a whoosh. "What is it?" she asked. "Wolves." Carrie gulped. "What do they want?" Swift Arrow looked at her kindly. "Probably the horses. Small game is gone now. Come." They hurried back to the cave. The others were up and waiting. Sky Woman built up the fire. "We must ride," Swift Arrow said. "The valley is still 3 days away." They packed and mounted the horses. Swift Arrow let them go first. He followed later, driving the horses through the snow. There was no trouble that day, nor the next. Early on the third day, Carrie thought that some of the horses were missing. At noon, they rested by a creek. Carrie watched Swift Arrow water the horses. She counted them. The piebald and the roan cavalry horse were missing. "What happened to the piebald and the roan?" she asked. "Did they run away?" Swift Arrow shook his head. "I left them," he said. He led Sky Woman's horse back up the bank. Carrie looked back the way they had come and shivered. Now she knew why the wolves had not followed them. They reached the valley before nightfall. The camp stretched out along the river bank. Melting snowdrifts tangled the long dry grass around the camp. The teepees had been placed closer together than they had during the summer. Their lodge poles made thin black crisscrosses against the gray sky. Smoke drifted lazily skyward. As they rode into camp, Carrie thought she had never seen anything more beautiful than the firefly glow of the cook fires.